Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's having a great morning. They're cozy in their rooms or in their living room or in a library or coffee shop. You're just enjoying your morning on our online classroom. So I have a cup of coffee. I'm in my sweater, so it's a cozy morning. And so we're just going to get right into it. So today we're going to be focusing on chapter 4. Within chapter 4, we're going to learn more about Joseph and his character, and we're going to learn how to empathize with him and hear his story of what has made him him. So we're going to focus in on this, and we're going to recap chapter 3 at the very end of what we just finished, and then we'll jump it right in. So if you guys will follow along with your books. I actually do not have my book today, so if you see my phone, this is why. I left my book in my parents' car this weekend, and so my mother sent me screenshots. So if you see my phone, I'm not texting, I'm not Snapchatting, I'm not doing anything of the sort, but I am reading the novel. So if you guys would read along with me, and we can do this together. So recapping chapter 3, we just ended with Joseph and Jack and his parents. They were all ice skating, and then Joseph is he kind of broke through and is wanting to share his story and who Jupiter is and who Madeline is and what made him him. So we're just going to jump right in, and we're going to start with chapter 4. So this is what he told us. Madeline Joyce was 13 years old when she met Joseph Brooks. She lived in a house that had pillars in the front and a wing on each side and statues on the lawn. Her father and her mother were both lawyers, so she spent a lot of time by herself in that big house when she wasn't away at her prep school. Sometimes she had a nanny who lived in the north guest house, sometimes not. The nanny was there the hot summer morning the plumber came to change the shower heads and the faucets in the upstairs bathrooms. All 5 of the upstairs bathrooms. He brought his son to carry the tools. His son was named Joseph. He was 13 years old too. 2 days later, Joseph knocked on Madeline's door, and he had walked 7 miles to get there. They spent the day together. They watched a few movies. She showed him how to play tennis on clay courts, and they walked through paths cut into the back acreage. Just before he left, he jumped into the pool with all of his clothes on. It would keep him cool on the way back home, he said. She laughed. That summer, Joseph came every day except the weekends when Madeline's parents were home. They watched movies, they played on clay courts, they walked along long walks through the back acreage, they swam in the pool. She laughed, and sometimes he did too. She never asked him why his face looked so beat up. He didn't tell her what his father was doing to him because he wasn't around anymore to carry the tools. That fall, she went away to school in Andover. It nearly killed Joseph. He went to the library computers every afternoon to write her. Writing stunk, but it was better than nothing. A little better than nothing. She came back home for Thanksgiving, and Joseph walked 7 miles to see her on the stormy, icy Friday afterward. The nanny answered the door. "Aren't you the plumber's boy?" she said. Joseph said he was. "Was Madeline home?" The nanny looked at him. "Go away before you get yourself into a lot of trouble you don't want." She closed the door. Joseph walked home. 7 miles. On Sunday, Madeline went back to her school in Andover. She came home again for Christmas break on the first Monday. Joseph walked 7 miles. It was cold and snowy, and Joseph's coat was too small. But he walked 7 miles and knocked on her door. This time, Madeline answered, and she held out her hands. She brought him inside. She had hot chocolate, and he had coffee in the kitchen. They had sat by the fire and talked and talked and talked. They went outside. Joseph used the gardener's old coat, and they walked through the quiet, snowy acreage holding hands. Madeline threw snowballs at him and hit him sometimes. He threw snowballs too, but he could never hit her. Not once. He couldn't even imagine hitting Madeline with a snowball because he loved her. He loved her. He had never known love before. He had never known how much it would fill him. He had never known anything, he thought. Behind the acreage, they walked along the frozen river, and Madeline pretended she was skating. She was beautiful beyond beautiful, even skating in her boots. The sun went down, and she skated in her boots, and skated, and skated, and skated. And Joseph watched her until the sky was dark, and Jupiter was up, and Joseph pointed to it. "It's my favorite planet," he said. She held his arm and looked at Jupiter and said, "Mine too, now." When they got back from the snowy woods, the nanny's car was in the driveway. Madeline told him to keep the coat, and Joseph walked home, 7 miles. Madeline's Christmas break lasted for 3 weeks. Joseph came every day except for the weekends. On the weekends, he stayed home and thought about Madeline until everything in him would almost burst. He had never known. How could he have known? On the day before Madeline had to go back to Andover, Joseph walked 7 miles to her house in a rain that was almost sleet, and the gardener's jacket did just about nothing to keep him warm. He was soaked and shivering when Madeline opened the door. She brought him over to the fireplace and found him a red woolen blanket. And what was he thinking he could die in weather like this? And he got out of his wet things and wrapped himself in the red wool blanket and sat close to the fire while she made hot chocolate and coffee. She brought the mugs in, and they sat together, and Madeline asked Joseph what he remembered about his mother, and he said he remembered going outside with her after a storm and pouring boiling maple syrup onto new snow and then eating it. That afternoon, while Joseph's things were drying, they boiled maple syrup, and Joseph put on the gardener's boots, and they took a pan outside. They found new snow, and they ladled the syrup onto powder. When it froze, sort of, Joseph picked it up and fed it to Madeline. And Madeline picked it up and fed it to Joseph. And she smeared some on his mouth, and she laughed, and she leaned forward and kissed him for the first time. Then they went back inside under the red woolen blanket. The nanny found them later, and the trouble she had predicted begun. She said that she wasn't going to be held responsible, and she wasn't going to lose her job over this. No, sir, she wasn't. But she did. Madeline's parents took out an injunction against Joseph. A policeman delivered it. Joseph was to have no contact at all with Madeline. Any violation meant that he would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, the very fullest extent. Then the state of Maine Department of Health and Human Services delivered their news. Joseph and his father would begin receiving monthly visits and evaluations. And Madeline was withdrawn from her school in Andover and sent to school in western Pennsylvania. Joseph did not know which one. 3 months later, the Department of Health and Human Services visited Joseph's father while Joseph was at school. Miss Stroud told him that Madeline Joyce was pregnant. She was still only 13 years old. Based upon this new information and Miss Stroud's observations, the DHHS had decided to remove Joseph from his home and to place him into a juvenile facility for boys. Miss Brooke should know that his son might face criminal charges. Wouldn't be for the first time, said Joseph's father to Miss Stroud, and probably not the last. Miss Stroud was waiting for Joseph when he came home from school. His father said, "Hey, stud, you got some girl." "Joseph," Miss Stroud said, "I want to talk with you about Madeline." Afterward he packed. He was sort of numb. He was going to be a father. A father! He was only 13. A father! He was going to be a father. And he knew he had to be with Madeline, and they were going to have a baby, and he had to keep the baby away from his father, and that meant they would have to leave Maine. Maybe Madeline's parents would help them. And that's what he asked Miss Stroud as they drove away. Could he see Madeline now? Would her parents help them? For a long time, Miss Stroud didn't say anything. She finally told him the truth. Madeline's parents were not going to help them, and he could not see Madeline. She was in school in western Pennsylvania for 2 more months, and then she would return home to New England. It was not Joseph's business where she would stay, and he should forget about her. He was only 13. He was going to be a father, he said. He was only 13, she said. Again, she took him to a group home for boys. He stayed one day and one night and left. Miss Joyce called the police when he showed up at their house. The police did not care when Joseph told them that he only wanted to talk to Madeline's parents. He only wanted them to know who he was and who he really was, so they would let him see Madeline. He wanted them to know he loved her. After that, if he didn't want to help with After that, if he didn't want to help them with the baby, then okay. He wanted them to know that they'd make it on their own. He would work. He would do whatever it took. He loved her. "How old are you, kid?" asked the policeman. Joseph told them. "You're just a baby yourself," and said the policeman. The police took him back to the group home. Joseph stayed 1 day and 1 night, and he left. The police found him on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, thumbing west. They took him to Lake Adams Juvenile, with a fence around it, a very high fence. The exits were always locked. During the night, the doors to his room was locked from the outside. In October, Miss Stroud came with papers. "What are they for?" said Joseph. "You're a minor," said Miss Stroud, "and your father is still your legal guardian. But we think it's important that you, as the father, sign the papers. They involve parent rights," said Joseph, "which you are signing over to the state so we can find the best future for your baby. And frankly, since your father is not cooperating, we need you to help us." That was how Joseph heard from the first time that he was now a father. He looked at the forms. The baby was a girl. Her name was Jupiter Joyce. Joseph wept. Miss Stroud handed him a photograph. "I'm really not supposed to give you this, but the baby was beautiful. Beautiful beyond beautiful. She was holding her perfect hands and her perfect fingers, and how perfect her fingernails up over her head, and her tiny mouth was wide with yawn, and her eyes were open as she was looking at him, right at him. And she was warm in a light green blanket and light green cap, and glowed with light and brightness, like the brightest planet in the dark sky." "Joseph," said Miss Stroud, "you need to sign these papers." "No," he said. "Joseph, Jupiter has to be put up for adoption. I promise you she will go to a good family who will love her and take care of her." "I love her. I'll take care of her." He put the picture in his pocket. "Joseph, you're barely 14. You can't take care of her. If you want to be what's best for Jupiter, we're what's best for Jupiter," said Joseph. "Maddie and me." Miss Stroud put her hand against Joseph's face. He did not move. "Joseph, I didn't want to tell you this. I thought it would be too much. Maybe it will be too much. But you have to sign these papers. If you don't, Madeline's parents will prosecute you." Joseph looked at her. "There were complications, Joseph. Madeline—" "Don't say anything. Don't," Joseph said quickly. "Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't. Joseph, please." That was how Joseph heard for the first time that he would never see Madeline again. Never touch her again, never talk to her again, never walk through the woods with her again. That was how Joseph heard for the first time that Madeline, whom he loved, was gone. "Madeline would want this," said Miss Stroud. Quickly he signed the papers and ran back toward his room. He stopped in the boys' bathroom. He didn't know what was coming over him, but it was huge and terrifying and strong. It was inside him and outside of him, and it was already starting to scream. And I was getting louder and louder, and his head was getting louder, and his brain was getting louder, and he threw water in his face, but he couldn't stop. And if he couldn't stop, he couldn't stop, and if he couldn't stop it. That was it. Okay, that was a lot. Continuing. When Manny Toole came in, he said Joseph looked like he needed something bad, and he couldn't have these if he wanted them. And he held out his hand, and there were 2 yellow pills. Joseph took them both and splashed water in his mouth, and the whole world exploded as he staggered into one of the stalls, shattered there until one teacher found them. Later, his hands bound behind him, they told Joseph he tried to kill the teacher. That's when Joseph went to Stone Mountain. He stayed 1 day and 1 night, and then he tried to leave. At the top of the fence, his foot caught in a roll of razor wire. When he pulled it free, the razor whipped over the top of his foot, and he fell. And the razor sliced open his foot, starting from his right arm and cutting all along almost to his knee. The doctor said that he had never put so many stitches into one boy's body before. When Miss Stroud came to see him, she said Madeline was gone, so where did he think he was going? Joseph didn't say anything. Miss Stroud said she couldn't help him if he wouldn't talk to her, so Joseph looked at her and said, "Where do you think I was going?" "Joseph," said Miss Stroud, "you can't be your father. You're only 14. "I am a father," said Joseph. "No, Miss Stroud, you signed away." "I'm Jupiter's father," said Joseph. "I will always be Jupiter's father." After that, he wouldn't talk with Miss Stroud. He wouldn't talk with anyone. He lived at Stone Mountain for a month. He wouldn't talk to anyone, not even when he got beat up. Not for the first time, not the second time, not the third time. Not even when they held him down, and he wouldn't talk anymore. After the 3rd time, Miss Stroud said she wanted to speak she was going to speak with the best foster parents she knew, and she couldn't promise anything. They had talked. They had taken in any. They hadn't taken any boys in for almost 12 years. They lived on an organic farm. Would he like that, living on a farm? They didn't have much technology, but they had a pond and acres of land and animals. What did he think? A week later, Joseph came to Eastham, and he began to milk cows. That night, after skating on the pond under the silver moon in Jupiter, Joseph talked more than he had ever talked before altogether. It was like he had finally figured out who he wanted to tell, and once he started, he couldn't stop until it was done. It took a long time. My father and mother and I didn't say anything. We hardly moved, except my father, who had added all the wood I had brought out to the fire. And when Joseph finally finished, he went up to the big barn, and we could hear Rosie mooing. I think he didn't want us to see him, but it was okay if Rosie saw. It was okay for Rosie to tell Joseph that she loved him. My father kicked out the fire. My mother held me. I said, "Why can't he see Jupiter?" And they said that I had to try to understand. Joseph was only 14. He couldn't be a father, and seeing Jupiter would only hurt him more. Jupiter might be upset, maybe even frightened. "Suppose you're wrong," I said. "Suppose Jupiter wants to find Joseph." My mother held me even closer, and my father put his hand on my back. Joseph came in late that night. He got ready for bed and then stood by the window, even though the room was really cold. He looked out the panes that were already a little frosted over, and the moonlight flooded him, and his scar was a bright, ragged line along his side. He leaned into the glass until his forehead touched the pane. He stood there perfectly still, the moonlight flooding him as if it was okay, it's a lot of reading. The moonlight flooding him as if it would drown him, but he didn't move. "Joseph," I finally said, "it's freezing." He didn't turn around. "What are you looking at?" "I can't see Jupiter," he said. "The moon's too bright, and I don't know where she is." "It's where it always is," I said. "No, it isn't." He wrapped his arms around himself, and when he finally turned, I could see his breath in the moonlight. "I'm going to find her," he said. "I'm not going to stay alone." You're not alone," he shook his head. "You're not." "I'm alone," he said. "You've got me," I said. He laughed, but not a happy laugh. "Jackie, I'm a whole lifetime ahead of you," he said. He left the window and climbed up on the bunk. The moonlight kept flooding into the darkness. "It's Jack," I said. "Yeah," he said. "And no, you're not." I said, and he settled into the bed. "Okay," he said. I woke up again and again that night, but I didn't hear Joseph moving or breathing or dreaming. If it hadn't been for a dent in his body made above me, I would have thought he was gone. Downstairs, the chimney clocks chimed the quarter hours, and I heard a lot of them. Until once I woke up and the dent was gone, and I jerked up, looking across the room. Joseph was standing by the window again. The moon was down, and he was looking for Jupiter in the cold and the dark. By morning it was snowing, not a lot, but enough to pile up on the branches, in the cupola on the barn, the wood pile, and if we wanted to skate again, we'd have to shovel off the ice on the pond again. The bus was a little late, and Mr. Haskell skidded the back tires in the new snow when he stopped for us. I guess Mr. Haskell didn't like the way that Joseph looked at him when he got on. "Hey, you think you could drive a bus better? Go ahead." He leaned back and pointed the steering wheel. "Go ahead." Joseph walked past him on the way back. "That's what I thought," said Mr. Haskell, and he levered the door closed and gunned the engine so the bus swayed sharply. Joseph walked down the aisle like he was walking on the sidewalk. I fell into Danny Nations. "You want to try finding yourself your own seat?" he said. I slid behind him next to Ernie Humfer, who was looking out the window like it was the most important thing in the whole wide world. "It's snow, Ernie," I said. "White flakes. They come down every week and every winter. You've seen them before." We passed Old First Congregational. Mr. Haskell skidded the back tires around for the left turn, so the Alliance Bridge came into view, and then whirled out of view like a movie camera going berserk. We all held on. Ernie turned to me, and his face was tight. "Listen, Jack. Relax, Ernie. He's not going into the river, or you won't die. Just listen. Don't hang out with the psycho back there, okay? What's that supposed to mean? Just don't hang out with him. Why? No reason. Ernie? I said no reason. Danny Nations leaned over the seat, twisting one of his earbuds. What's so serious back here? Nothing, said Ernie. I think someone's tidy whities got a little too tight, said Danny. Shut up, said Ernie, and went back looking out the window. So, that is the end of chapter 4. I'm going to encourage you guys to take about 5 minutes and write just your thoughts about this chapter, what Joseph's feelings may have made you feel, and just interpret how this chapter made you feel, how Joseph may have felt. And say you were sitting around the campfire and you were the one listening to Joseph open up to you about what has happened with him and Maddie and Jupiter. And so then also with this conversation with Ernie, what do you think is to come? So, and what are your predictions in the future? What's going to come in the future chapters? So, I've enjoyed my time together with you today. I hope you have a great afternoon and a great evening, and we'll talk soon. So, bye!